Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. The Russian army was captured in Ukraine. The attacks of the Ukrainian heroic soldiers on the occupied areas by the Russian troops continue at full speed. The Ukrainian army is very determined to take back the areas under the Russian military domination. Russian soldiers continue to retreat as Ukrainian warriors push the Russian army in the occupied areas. Russian troops find their way out in the irresistible Ukrainian attacks. After the Russian army began its invasion in February, it was quite effective in its attacks on the Ukrainian fronts. The Russian army managed to occupy many regions in Ukraine. The victories of the Russian army in Ukraine caused the Russian soldiers to relax. The Ukrainian army, taking advantage of the deficits of the Russian soldiers, attacked to retake many areas occupied by the Russian soldiers. The attempt of the Ukrainian warriors to clear Russian fronts began to bear fruit. The Ukrainian army, with the support of its allies, covered its army with an invincible armor. Thanks to the weapons support provided by NATO and EU countries to the Ukrainian army was able to take a step forward against the Russian army. The Ukrainian army, using the modern and state-of-the-art weapons it added to its inventory, caused the Russian army to weaken in a short time. The Russian army became unable to withstand the attacks of the Ukrainian forces. The Russian army, which came to the point of collapse with the attacks of the Ukrainian army, lost thousands of its soldiers in Ukraine. According to the statements made by the Ukrainian authorities, the loss of the soldiers of the Russian army in Ukraine is around 65,000, and the data announced by the USA claims that the loss of the soldiers of the Russian army is over 80,000. Among the most important reasons for the losses of the Russian army in Ukraine are the wrong decisions taken by the Russian leader Putin. Russian leader Putin tried many strategies to end the advances of the Ukrainian army, but none of them were successful. One of the biggest mistakes of the Russian leader is the declaration of mobilization announced in the past months. The declaration of mobilization announced by Putin in the past months received a great reaction to Russia. First of all, the Russian people turned their backs on Putin. The declaration of mobilization, which included sending 300,000 Russian men to war in Ukraine, caused an uprising among the Russian people. The Russian people took to the streets and chanted slogans against Russian leader Putin. Putin's mobilization decision confuses Russia. As another result of the imposition of mobilization, a large migration movement began in Russia. Russian men began to leave their country to escape fighting in Ukraine. Hours after Putin's mobilization announcement, Russian men flocked to the border areas to flee to neighboring countries. Despite all these negative developments after Putin's declaration of mobilization, the Russian leader thanked everyone who supported and contributed during the mobilization process. However, the facts were not as they seemed. There was a reason for the loss of strength of the Russian army in Ukraine. After the reserve soldiers who joined the Russian army with mobilization were sent to the Russian fronts in Ukraine, the advance of the Ukrainian army visibly increased. The Russian army began to lose more soldiers in Ukraine. The fact that the Ukrainian army seized the regions occupied by the Russian army one by one and began to dominate the region was the biggest evidence of the failure of the reserve soldiers who came to the army with mobilization. The heroic struggle of the Ukrainian army in the lands occupied by the Russian army greatly intimidated the Russian reservists. A large number of Russian reserve soldiers found the solution to leave the region. Thousands of Russian reservists surrendered to the Ukrainian army. Thousands of Russians continue to be held as prisoners by the Ukrainian army. On the Russian front, where the Ukrainian army attacked, there was a new incident that showed the helplessness of the mobilized Russian soldiers. Vladimir Putin's untrained soldiers have been stigmatized as chaotic by a former US general over footage showing a Russian squad fighting in Ukraine fleeing. Retired US General Mark Hertling has exploded the chaotic behavior of the Russian forces after footage emerged showing Putin's troops knocking over their armored vehicles during an undisciplined retreat under fire. The footage, which has not been independently altered, shows a Russian team hastily climbing onto an infantry fighting vehicle to evade a Ukrainian attack and was sent flying only when the BTR crashed into a ditch. Retired US General Mark Hertling drew attention to the undisciplined attitude of the soldiers who joined the Russian army in mobilization. Mr. Hertling, you see undisciplined soldiers everywhere, soldiers who have jumped into this BTR from the very beginning without uniform. Some Russian soldiers wearing baseball caps behind them are firing mortar shells into the turret of this vehicle. In the shared image and video, you hear the Ukrainian truck commander say, "Stop, find a place to stand." The Russian soldier says, "I don't know where to stand." Presumably, some soldiers on top of the vehicle suddenly fall into the ditch because they block the driver's view, and it's just a comedy of errors, he continued. Retired US General Mark Hertling said, "I mean, that's what soldiers look for, not in a group of soldiers, but in an undisciplined, chaotic mob, and that represents what we have seen in an untrained force from the very beginning." In addition to Mr. Hertling's remarks, in this case, I'm sure some of the soldiers were either badly injured or perhaps killed when that vehicle rolled over, and it was because they didn't know how to perform the kind of skills that are only expected of soldiers on the battlefield, he said. Many of the soldiers mobilized into the Russian army are criminals who are uneducated, inexperienced in combat, unfit for military service, and even convicted in Russian prisons. The training problem of the mobilized Russian soldiers has a heavy burden on the Russian army. Russia decided to get to the root of the problem and train Russian reservists, but it may be too late for everything, because the only problem with the mobilized Russian soldiers is not on the fronts in Ukraine. Russian reservists are also causing confusion in the Russian barracks in Ukraine. Every day, big fights and arguments take place in Russian barracks because of the Russian reservists. The scale of the fights in the Russian barracks sometimes so great that the fight results in dozens of Russian soldiers being injured and hospitalized. Russian reservists are starting big rebellions in the barracks. The Russian reserve soldiers displaying their undisciplined attitudes here are opposing the orders of the Russian commanders. Some reserve soldiers may even attempt to make physical contact with the Russian commanders. There was a scandalous incident between the mobilized Russian soldiers and the Russian barracks commander in the past weeks. Russian reserve soldiers, after the Russian commander's statements that you will be cannon fodder in Ukraine, Russian reserve soldiers attacked the Russian commander in the ward and hospitalized him. After the incident, Russian reserve soldiers were sent to another Russian barrack. When the Russian leader Putin could not find what he expected from the mobilized Russian soldiers, he started new searches. The Russian leader's only hope to thwart the Ukrainian attack is his mercenary special forces fighting in Ukraine. The Russian Wagner group, which took part in the conflicts in Ukraine, began to recruit mercenaries from different countries in order to compensate for the losses of the Russian army. The Russian Wagner group first targeted US-trained Afghanistan fighters to fight against Ukraine. The Russian Wagner group leader reported that, upon the call, thousands of Afghan soldiers applied to join our unit. The Russian Wagner group leader claimed that after the well-trained professional Afghan soldiers came to Ukraine, the balance in the country would change. In response to the statements of the Russian Wagner group leader, war analysts were asked to explain why, if the Afghan fighters were as good as they claimed, they did not succeed in defending their country against the Taliban. Russia was faced with losing the dominance of almost all regions with a single mistake. We can understand the importance of every step to be taken in the war in the results of Putin's decision. It looks like Putin will continue to pay the bill for the decision he made in Ukraine for a long time. Zelensky's army continues to clear the occupied areas from Russian soldiers by using the weakness of the Russian army. Freedom for Ukrainians is now much closer. Thank you for watching us.